Hey there, mystery hunters. There's a number stalking humanity, and most of you have never even noticed it. 3. It's carved into the pyramids. It's wired into your DNA. It's stamped on gods from cultures that never met. Coincidence? Yeah, sure. And I've got beachfront property on Mars to sell you. Ancient astronaut theorists believe somebody dropped this code on us a long time ago, then ghosted us harder than a bad first date. Triangles in stone, triads in religion, triplets in your genes. Either humanity has the most boring favourite number ever, or someone was trying really hard to tell us something. So hit that like button if you're ready to question everything, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's roll. Picture this. You're standing in the Egyptian desert. The sun is hammering down so hard you'd happily trade your soul for a bottle of cold water and some shade. And right in front of you, 3 colossal stone monsters punch straight up out of the sand like the planet itself decided to grow teeth. These are the pyramids of Giza, and they've been holding this exact pose for over 4,000 years. No selfie breaks, no water bottles, just pure stubborn geometry staring back at the sky. Now here's where things get spicy. There are 3 of them. Not 2, not 4. 3. Lined up in formation like the world's oldest boy band waiting for their cue. And mainstream Egyptologists will tell you, yeah, the pharaohs Khufu, Khafre and Menkaure each wanted their own tomb, so a trio just happened to land in the same neighbourhood. Convenient family planning. Case closed. Except, well, no, not exactly. Because that explanation falls apart the moment you look up. In 1983, a Belgian engineer named Robert Boval was kicking around in the desert when he noticed something that's haunted alternative researchers ever since. The 3 pyramids don't just sit there at random. They mirror almost perfectly the 3 stars in the belt of the constellation Orion. Same angles, same offset on the middle one, same proportional spacing. If you took a long exposure of Orion's belt and slammed it down onto a satellite map of Giza, the stars would land basically on the pyramid tips. This is called the Orion correlation theory, and academic Egyptologists hate it the way cats hate baths. But the geometry doesn't really care about anyone's feelings. Ancient astronaut theorists look at that alignment and ask the obvious question. How does a Bronze Age civilization, without GPS, satellites, drones, or even a basic spirit level you'd find in a Home Depot clearance bin, manage to map a constellation onto the desert with the precision of a NASA engineer? Their answer is the kind of answer that gets you uninvited from polite academic dinners. Somebody helped. Somebody who knew exactly what Orion looked like from above. Somebody who wasn't from around here. And then there's the shape itself, the pyramid. 4 triangular faces climbing to a single point. 4 bases, but the form that defines the whole structure is the triangle, and the triangle is built on the number 3. 3 sides, 3 corners. 3 is the bare minimum number of points you need to make a stable plane in geometry. 2 points just give you a line. 3 give you a surface, a foundation, a thing. The ancient Egyptians knew this, and they didn't just know it casually. They built their entire afterlife philosophy around it. The pyramid's peak was understood as a portal, a launch pad, the point where the dead pharaoh stopped being a guy in a fancy hat and started being a god, riding a beam of stone straight up into the cosmos. Now think about that for a second. The Egyptians genuinely believed these monuments were transportation devices. Not metaphorically, literally. The pyramid texts, which are some of the oldest religious writings on the planet, talk about the king ascending to the stars, specifically in many passages to Orion, the same constellation the pyramids on the ground are mirroring. So you've got buildings shaped like cosmic launch ramps, arranged to match a constellation, with internal writings that say the whole point is to go to that constellation. At what point does coincidence start blushing and admitting it's been caught? And the engineering. Oh, the engineering. The Great Pyramid alone is built from somewhere around 2.5 million blocks of stone, some weighing as much as 80 tons. To put that in perspective, 80 tons is roughly the weight of a fully loaded semi-truck. Now imagine dragging a semi-truck across the desert without wheels, without iron tools, without pulleys as we'd recognise them, and stacking it 450 feet in the air with margins of error so tight a credit card barely fits between the blocks. The official story is ramps and rope, and a workforce of motivated labourers who really, really loved their pharaoh. Ancient astronaut theorists raise an eyebrow and ask if maybe there was a little outside consulting involved, possibly from beings who didn't need lunch breaks. The base of the Great Pyramid is aligned to true north, with an accuracy of about 1/20th of a degree. Modern construction crews working with laser-guided equipment routinely do worse. There's a reason researchers keep circling back to the idea that something or someone with knowledge way beyond Bronze Age toolkits was involved. Either the ancient Egyptians were the most criminally underrated geniuses in human history, or, and stay with me here, they had help. And if the help came from somewhere off-world, then the triangle wasn't just an architectural style choice, it was a signature, a calling card, a logo, basically, for whoever was doing the helping. Around the 6th century BC, a Greek mathematician shows up and gets credit for a piece of geometry that suddenly explains a whole lot of what the Egyptians had already been doing for 2,000 years. His name was Pythagoras. You probably remember him from middle school, where he ruined a perfectly good afternoon with a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That little equation describes the relationship between the sides of a right triangle, and Western civilization has been spinning around it ever since. But here's the part your geometry teacher probably skipped, possibly because it would have triggered a parent-teacher conference. Pythagoras didn't come up with the theorem in some sunny Greek garden between sips of wine. According to multiple ancient sources, including Herodotus, Pythagoras spent around 22 years studying with Egyptian priests. 22 years. That's longer than most people stay in any single career today. He learned mathematics, astronomy, mysticism, and a whole bunch of stuff the Egyptian priesthood kept behind closed doors and refused to share with outsiders. By the time he came back to Greece, he wasn't really a Greek thinker bringing fresh ideas. He was a guy smuggling temple secrets across the Mediterranean and rebranding them with his own logo. And what did the Egyptian priests tell him about the triangle? They said the math was sacred. They said it didn't come from people. They said it was given. By whom? By the gods. Now, in modern academic translation, that means mythology, allegory, cute spiritual storytelling. But ancient astronaut theorists translate it differently. They take it literally. The priest was saying with a straight face that this knowledge arrived from beings who came down from the sky. Same beings, possibly, who helped stack the pyramids. Same beings who liked the number 3 so much they encoded it into the foundational geometry of reality. For Pythagoras himself, the triangle became something almost religious. He founded a secret society where members weren't even allowed to eat beans, but they were allowed to worship numbers, and his favourite number, by miles, was 3. He called it the perfect number, the number of harmony, the key that unlocked the structure of the universe. He believed that 3 contained the secret of everything, from the music of the spheres to the architecture of the soul. Pythagoras wasn't just doing math. He was running a mystery cult with a triangle on the door, and the password was a number he'd brought home in his luggage from Egypt. Naturally, mainstream history wants this to be one of those harmless cultural exchange stories. Greek student, foreign mentors, intellectual progress, hooray for civilization. But here's the awkward little detail nobody wants to highlight. The Egyptians, who supposedly gifted Pythagoras this divine math, kept insisting they didn't invent it either. The trail keeps running uphill. Egypt got it from the gods, Greece got it from Egypt, we got it from Greece. Every step in the chain points back to a source that the people themselves describe as not human. You'd think the story would at least start in Egypt, right? Pyramid civilization, hieroglyphs, the whole spectacle. Surely that's ground zero for sacred triangle worship. Except, surprise, it isn't. Because if you fly across the Mediterranean and land in northwestern France, in a place called Karnak, you'll find something that should not, by any reasonable timeline, exist. Karnak is home to over 3,000 standing stones. They've been standing there for more than 6,000 years. That makes them older than the pyramids, older than written history in most of the world, older than the wheel in some regions, and someone, with absolutely no documented civilization to speak of, hauled these massive rocks into precise geometric arrangements across miles of countryside. We're talking stones weighing several tons each, dragged into rows, circles, and, here's the kicker, triangles. Specifically, right triangles whose proportions match the same Pythagorean relationships that wouldn't be formally written down for another 4,000 years. Let that sink in for a second. People who didn't have writing, didn't have metal tools, and definitely didn't have a Greek philosopher in their study group, somehow knew geometry that wouldn't officially exist until thousands of years later. Naturally, the official explanation is a shrug. Maybe they figured it out by accident. Maybe they were just really into the vibes. Maybe they got lucky 3,000 times in a row across multiple sites on multiple continents. Sure. And maybe I just won the lottery while typing this. It's not just Karnak. Cross the channel into England and you've got Stonehenge, where the same precise geometric ratios show up baked into the layout. Just down the road sits Avebury, the largest stone circle in Europe, where the spacing and angles of the stones reveal more Pythagorean math hiding in plain sight. 3 different megalithic sites separated by hundreds of miles, predating Pythagoras by millennia, all whispering the same mathematical truth. Either these were the chattiest, most networked Stone Age engineers in history, or they were all reading from the same instruction manual that nobody on Earth had written yet. Ancient astronaut theorists look at this scattered network of triangle-shaped stone monuments, each one built independently, each one encoding the same divine geometry, and they ask the question mainstream archaeology refuses to entertain. What if this knowledge didn't spread human to human? What if it was downloaded? What if a civilization or an intelligence, way beyond what humans could have managed on their own, visited multiple locations across the planet, dropped off the same blueprint, and let our ancestors get busy building? The triangle, the number 3, the sacred ratios. Not local inventions, not cultural coincidences, a global signature, a signal hidden in stone, waiting patiently for someone to look up from their phone long enough to notice. And we're just getting started, because once you accept that the triangle and the number 3 might be something more than human inventions, the trail leads straight into the gods themselves. And spoiler alert, they tend to come in 3s too. If a global stone-based geometry lesson left by mystery teachers wasn't suspicious enough, wait until you meet the gods. Because the same pattern that's hiding in the architecture is hiding in the deities too. Every major early civilization somehow, independently, without any group chat to coordinate, decided that the divine works best in packs of 3. Start in Egypt, since that's where we keep ending up. The headline trio is Osiris, Isis, and Horus. Dad, Mum, and the kid who gets revenge after Dad gets murdered by his shady brother. Family drama with a galactic twist. The Egyptians didn't treat this trinity as a casual lineup. They treated it as a fundamental structure of the universe itself. Osiris ruled the underworld and the dead, Isis governed magic and the living, and Horus represented the sky and kingship. 3 roles, 3 dimensions of existence, all wrapped up in one tidy package. And every pharaoh from this point on basically auditioned for the role of Horus during life, and Osiris after death. Now, naturally, you'd think this kind of family-centered religion was an Egyptian original. They had the head start. They had the pyramids, the priesthood, the great PR. Except, awkwardly, the Sumerians beat them to it by about 1,000 years. The Sumerians lived in what's now southern Iraq, and they were busy inventing writing, cities, beer, and bureaucracy, while everyone else was still trying to figure out fire safety. Their top tier of gods was a trinity too: Anu, Enlil, and Enki. Anu was the Sky Father, the cosmic boss, the guy upstairs nobody actually met. Enlil ran the air, weather, and pretty much every consequential decision down here. Enki handled water, wisdom, and creation, and was, in basically every myth, the one who actually liked humans enough to do them a favour now and then. If those names sound familiar, it's because they're the heavy hitters in the Anunnaki mythology that ancient astronaut researchers, especially the late Zecharia Sitchin, built an entire alternative history around. According to that interpretation, the Anunnaki weren't just gods. They were physical beings who came down from the sky, set up shop in Mesopotamia and started running the place. And their command structure had 3 at the top. Not 5, not 7, 3. Same number that keeps showing up in the stones, the math, and the architecture. Now zoom east, because the Trinity addiction was apparently a worldwide pandemic. In India we get the Trimurti, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. The creator, the preserver, and the destroyer. 3 cosmic functions that together run the entire existence of the universe in a never-ending loop of birth, sustenance, and demolition. Hindu philosophy is older than most Western mythology by significant margins, and the Trimurti shows up in foundational texts that nobody can credibly link to either Egypt or Sumer. These cultures had no group meetings, no shared library, no postal service running between the Nile and the Ganges, and yet here we are, with 3 gods running the show under different brand names. Hop over to ancient Ireland, Scotland, and the rest of the Celtic territories, and you bump into the triple goddess: Maiden, Mother, and Crone. 3 faces of one divine feminine power, representing the cycle of life from youth through maturity to wisdom. Celtic religion was notoriously oral, meaning they didn't write a lot of it down, which means everything we know comes from later sources, mostly grumpy Roman observers and Christian monks who took notes while disapproving. But the threefold goddess shows up across Celtic mythology with a consistency that's hard to ignore. Brigid, the Morrigan, the Matronae. Same three-part structure, different costumes, and then, naturally, you get to Christianity. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Holy Trinity. One God in three persons, which is a doctrine that's caused more theological brawls than any other concept in church history. Christians have been arguing about how exactly the three are one for almost 2,000 years, and nobody's quite settled it. But here's the funny thing. Christianity inherited this triadic structure even though strict monotheism, the kind it claims to be, has no logical reason to feature a trinity at all. One God means one God. Yet somehow the same three-part divine pattern slipped right in, just like it slipped into every other religion humanity has ever cooked up. Mainstream comparative religion scholars handle this by waving their hands and saying, well, the number 3 is just psychologically pleasing to humans. We like patterns of 3, beginning, middle, end, past, present, future, mum, dad, kid. Apparently the universe assembled its entire pantheon based on what would test well in a focus group. It's an explanation that requires you to ignore the fact that other numbers are also psychologically pleasing, and they did not get the same global rollout. Where's the universal quartet of gods? Where's the divine pair that dominates every culture? Why specifically 3, everywhere? Almost as if someone went door to door with the same instruction manual. Ancient astronaut theorists think the answer is exactly that. Somebody made a delivery. The same source that left triangle geometry in the stones left triadic theology in the spirituality. Same fingerprint, different medium, and just when you think the pattern can't get any tighter, along comes a single figure who basically embodies the entire concept in human form. Around the 4th century BC, in the cultural blender of Egypt and Greece after Alexander the Great rolled through, a name starts appearing in mystical texts, Hermes Trismegistus. The name literally means Hermes the thrice great, not double great, thrice great, 3 again. Because of course, Hermes Trismegistus was not a normal historical person, and that's putting it generously. Greek tradition merged him with the Egyptian god Thoth, the divine scribe who supposedly invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and basically every useful piece of knowledge the ancient world had. According to the various legends, Hermes Trismegistus didn't just teach humanity these things. He arrived from the sky. He came down on some kind of flying craft, in some accounts a luminous vessel, in others a wheeled chariot of fire, and he stuck around long enough to give early civilization a complete intellectual starter pack before heading back up to wherever he'd come from. You'd think a guy with this resume would have a birth certificate. He doesn't. There's no agreed-upon biography, no tomb, no childhood. He just kind of appears in the historical record, fully formed, already triple great, dispensing wisdom to bewildered humans who immediately assume he must be a god. Mainstream historians categorize him as a syncretic figure, which is academic for a god several cultures glued together and pretended was one entity. Ancient astronaut theorists categorize him differently. They look at the descriptions, the sky vessel, the advanced knowledge, the messenger role between humans and higher beings, and they say, well, this is just an alien with better PR. And the wisdom he supposedly left behind wasn't casual stuff. It was foundational. The Hermetic tradition, named after him, became the underground river that fed Western mysticism, astrology, alchemy, and a huge chunk of early science. His teachings were said to be encoded, hidden inside symbols and metaphors that only initiated students could decode. Why encode them? Because the knowledge was too powerful to hand out to anyone who could read. The wrong people with the wrong intentions could level civilizations with it. Or so the story goes, which, depending on your level of cynicism, either sounds like ancient marketing or sounds like exactly the kind of safety protocol an off-world visitor would put in place before leaving us alone with the keys. What makes Hermes Trismegistus so interesting isn't even the legend itself, it's the influence. His name and his texts kept echoing through history long after the Greek and Egyptian temples were rubble. Medieval Arab scholars treated his writings like sacred technical manuals. Renaissance philosophers like Marsilio Ficino dropped everything to translate them. Even some of the people we now consider founders of modern science studied his work obsessively. The thrice great messenger was still teaching people 15 centuries after he supposedly walked the earth, which is a pretty solid afterlife for a guy who may or may not have ever existed in the first place. And the discipline he influenced most heavily, the one that carried his ideas across continents and centuries, was alchemy. Now, modern audiences hear the word alchemy and immediately picture cartoon wizards trying to turn lead into gold so they can buy a bigger castle. That's not entirely wrong, but it's like describing rocket science as people who really like fireworks. Alchemy, especially in its serious form, was a complete philosophical system about transformation. Of metals, yes, but also of matter, energy, the soul, and the human being itself. Human. And at the absolute core of alchemical theory you'll find, surprise of surprises, a trio, the three principles, sulfur, mercury, and salt. Now don't get distracted by the names, because alchemists use these terms in a way that has almost nothing to do with the chemicals you'd find in a high school lab. In their system, sulfur represented the soul, the active fiery principle, the part of a substance that gives it character and identity. Mercury represented the spirit, the volatile connective principle, the part that moves and changes and links things together. Salt represented the body, the stable physical principle, the part that holds form and stays put. Three forces, working in combination, making up everything in the material world, from a chunk of iron to a human being to a star. Mainstream historians of science usually treat the three principles as a charming pre-scientific mistake, a misguided attempt to understand chemistry before the actual periodic table showed up and explained things properly. But if you squint at the alchemical model, you start noticing something uncomfortable. They were trying to describe matter as the result of three interacting components: the active, the connective, and the stable. Compare that to modern atomic physics, where atoms are described as protons, neutrons, and electrons, three particles: positive, neutral, negative, active, connective, stable. Now this could be a coincidence so massive it has its own gravitational field. Or, as ancient astronaut theorists argue, it could be that the alchemists were working from a downgraded but still functional version of a real cosmic blueprint, originally handed off by Hermes Trismegistus or whoever he really was, and they encoded that blueprint in symbolic language because the actual science behind it was way beyond Bronze Age comprehension. They weren't making things up. They were preserving something they didn't fully understand, using the symbols available to them and waiting for a future humanity to crack the code. The three principles travelled. They got picked up by Arab scholars during the golden age of Islamic science, who refined the chemistry, added rigour, and passed the knowledge into medieval Europe. From there, alchemy became the dominant intellectual obsession of educated Europeans for centuries. The list of people who took it seriously is not a list of cranks. It includes some of the most influential thinkers in Western history, several of whom we still consider geniuses today, despite the lab coats and the bubbling beakers and the slight whiff of cosmic conspiracy. Because here's the thing nobody tells you in chemistry class. Modern chemistry didn't replace alchemy by proving it wrong. Modern chemistry grew out of alchemy, the way a butterfly grows out of a caterpillar that had a really weird relationship with sulfur. The same people who started doing real experimental science were studying hermetic texts in their off hours. The same minds that gave us the laws of motion were chasing the philosopher's stone in their basements. And the bridge between the magical and the scientific, the symbol the alchemists used to describe the deepest truth they knew, was always the same one, the number 3. Of all the strange artifacts the alchemists chased across centuries, one document mattered more than any other. It was supposedly the source code, the original. The piece of writing they believed contained the actual instructions for how reality works, encoded by Hermes Trismegistus himself before he packed up and left the building. They called it the Emerald Tablets. Or sometimes the Emerald Tablet, depending on which version of the legend you're reading, because nobody can keep their stories straight when the document in question keeps slipping in and out of history, like it's allergic to documentation. According to the tradition, the Emerald Tablets were carved on slabs of green crystal, not painted, not etched in ink, carved into actual emerald, or possibly into some kind of green stone that resembled it. The text was short, dense, and reads like somebody trying to explain quantum physics using only haiku. Phrases like, as above, so below, as within, so without. The whole tablet boils down to a handful of cryptic statements about how the universe is structured, how energy moves, how transformation happens, and, most importantly for our purposes, how everything in existence can be traced back to the interaction of three primal forces. The most famous line, the one that ancient astronaut researchers absolutely cannot stop quoting, says something to the effect of, "The three is the great mystery that comes forth from the great." Now, depending on which translation you're reading, the phrasing wobbles. Some versions say the three is the great mystery proceeding from the one. Others lean into the cosmic language and call it the secret of secrets. But the core message stays consistent. Three is not just a number, it's the operating principle of reality, given to humanity by something or someone called the Great, with a capital G. And whoever the Great was, they weren't filing taxes in Cairo. Now here's where the story gets fun. According to multiple legends, the Emerald Tablets were discovered, of all places, inside the Great Pyramid. Some accounts say a Greek conqueror named Alexander, yes, that Alexander, the one who couldn't stop conquering things, supposedly found them during his Egyptian campaign. Other accounts push the discovery back further, attributing it to ancient priests or even to a sage named Apollonius of Tyana, who allegedly stumbled into a hidden chamber and walked out with knowledge that would echo for 2,000 years. Naturally, the original tablets, if they ever existed, are conveniently missing. The text survives only in copies of translations, which is how you can tell a document is either ancient and important or extremely well marketed. But the legends don't stop at finder. They get specific about what the tablets actually promised. Anyone who could master the knowledge encoded inside them would gain, and I'm not exaggerating the language here, mastery over life and death. That's the actual claim. Not mastery over silver, not mastery over bread baking, mastery over the literal boundary between being alive and being dead. The Emerald Tablets weren't selling self-help. They were selling a path to becoming something more than human. Possibly even something like the beings who supposedly authored the tablets in the first place, which makes the authorship question deeply weird. Because the credited author was, of course, Hermes Trismegistus, the same thrice great messenger we already met, the same figure who shows up in the historical record with no parents, no birth city, and an inventory of cosmic knowledge that nobody around him could possibly have given him. Ancient astronaut theorists look at this and shrug. They say, yes, obviously. The off-world visitor left a manual. The manual described reality in terms of threes. The manual was carved into something durable specifically, so it could survive thousands of years of human civilization trying to lose it. And the manual promised that whoever decoded it would graduate to a higher form of existence. This is not a religious metaphor, this is, in their reading, a literal upgrade kit. Mainstream historians have a different take. They point out that the Emerald Tablets are first mentioned, with any reliability, in Arab sources from around the 8th century AD, long after Hermes Trismegistus was supposedly handing them out. The earliest surviving versions are in Arabic, with Latin translations following in medieval Europe. So the official position is that the tablets are a much later mystical text, dressed up in ancient costuming to give it credibility, which was a popular move in alchemical circles. Slap an ancient Egyptian name on it, charge double. Same energy as putting the word artisanal on a sandwich today. The trouble with that explanation is that the medieval audience for these tablets was not stupid. They were the brightest minds of their era, and they treated the Emerald Tablets like a foundational text. Not a curiosity, not a fun read, a foundational text. The kind of document you build an entire intellectual movement around, which is suspicious behaviour to throw at a forgery, especially when the people doing the building had the academic resources to spot one. Either there really was something genuine underneath the legend, or every smart person in medieval Europe got punked by the same scam for 600 years. The list of people who took the Emerald Tablets seriously reads like a greatest hits album of Western intellectual history. Arab scholars during the Islamic Golden Age treated them as the cornerstone of their alchemical research. Renaissance philosophers placed them on the same shelf as Plato. By the early modern period, when actual science was just starting to peel away from mysticism, the tablets still had a fan base, and the most famous fan, the absolute showstopper on that list, the one who really should not have been into this stuff, was a guy named Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton. The Isaac Newton. The man who wrote the Principia Mathematica. The guy who figured out gravity, allegedly because an apple bonked him on the head, although the apple story is itself a piece of legend that's almost certainly been embellished. The father of classical physics. The reason your high school physics class has 3 laws of motion. 3, again. Just throwing that out there. The official Newton, the one in your textbook, is a stern-looking man in a powdered wig who calmly invented calculus, while everyone else was still trying to figure out long division. Genius mathematician, rigorous scientist, father of the modern empirical method, statue worthy in every possible way. The actual Newton, the one his contemporaries knew, and the one whose private papers eventually came to light, was a substantially weirder character. Newton spent more of his life on alchemy than on physics. Substantially more. The economist John Maynard Keynes, who bought a chunk of Newton's surviving papers at auction in 1936, famously said that Newton was not the first of the Age of Reason. He was the last of the magicians. Keynes was being literal. When Newton died in 1727, he left behind an enormous trove of manuscripts that had nothing to do with the equations of motion. Hundreds of thousands of words on alchemy, detailed laboratory notes from years of furnace experiments, astrological calculations, biblical chronologies obsessed with hidden patterns, and critically his own translations of ancient Hermetic texts, including the Emerald Tablets. The man who quantified the universe in mathematical terms was, on his off days and most of his on days, trying to crack a code he believed had been left for humanity by a figure who may have been an alien messenger from prehistory. The Royal Society, which Newton presided over for many years, found this stuff so embarrassing when they got around to cataloguing it that they basically buried the alchemy papers. For 200 years they sat in private collections, locked away, occasionally peeked at by scholars who would then politely refuse to discuss what they'd seen. The image of Newton as the pure rationalist was the one everyone wanted to keep. The actual Newton, sweating over crucibles in the middle of the night trying to extract the philosopher's stone from various metals, was inconvenient for the brand. So they put him in the closet and locked the door. But the papers exist. They survive. The Cambridge University Library and the Jewish National Library in Jerusalem now hold large portions of his alchemical writings, and any researcher can go look at them. And what those papers show is unambiguous. Newton believed the ancient texts contained real knowledge, not symbolic poetry, not mystical fluff, real, technical knowledge about how matter, energy, and consciousness actually work. He thought the alchemists, going all the way back to the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, had been pointing at something true, and that the language of three principles, three forces, three foundational interactions was the key to unlocking it. This is the same Newton who gave us, completely independently, three laws of motion. An object at rest stays at rest unless a force acts on it. Force equals mass times acceleration. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Three laws. 3. Coincidence, sure, in a vacuum. But not when the guy formulating those laws is also, simultaneously, writing manuscripts about how 3 is the secret of reality, and translating documents that say the same thing in Greek and Arabic. At some point you start wondering whether the laws of motion came out of pure mathematical reasoning, or whether Newton was pattern matching from something he'd read in a smoky cottage at 3 a.m, while his cat wondered why Dad never came to bed. Ancient astronaut researchers love this part of the story, and frankly they have a point. The single greatest scientific mind in Western history, the man who unlocked the basic mathematical language of the cosmos, spent decades convinced that the same knowledge had been delivered to humanity in ancient times, by sources that, in his own writing, he described in terms that sound a lot like otherworldly intelligences. He thought the ancients knew something. He thought he was rediscovering it, not inventing it. And he organized his entire intellectual life around the assumption that science and ancient mysticism were two paths up the same mountain. Newton wasn't dabbling. He was all in. He believed. He believed that the ancient code, transmitted through figures like Hermes Trismegistus, written in documents like the Emerald Tablets, encoded the actual structure of the cosmos. He believed the number 3 sat at the center of it, and he was either, depending on your view, completely deluded despite being one of the smartest humans who ever lived, or he was onto something the rest of us are still catching up to. 3 centuries later, when modern physics started describing reality in terms of 3 particles, 3 fundamental forces and 3 spatial dimensions, the question of who exactly was deluded started looking less obvious. Maybe Newton wasn't running from rationalism. Maybe he was running towards something that hadn't been named yet, in a vocabulary that hadn't been invented yet, using the only map he had, and that map, ancient and green, and supposedly delivered by a visitor from the sky, kept telling him the same thing in 3 different languages. 3 is the great mystery. 3 is the key. 3 is the signal. Fast forward 2.5 centuries past Newton's candlelit alchemy lab and land in Cambridge, England in March of 1953. A scrappy young biologist named James Watson and his older, sharper-tongued collaborator Francis Crick come bursting into a local pub one afternoon and announce to anyone within earshot that they've just figured out the secret of life. Bartenders presumably nodded politely and kept pouring beer, because every Cambridge regular has heard that one before. But this time, annoyingly for everyone else trying to drink in peace, the 2 scientists were actually telling the truth. What Watson and Crick had cracked, with significant uncredited help from a brilliant chemist named Rosalind Franklin, whose X-ray photographs basically handed them the answer on a silver platter, was the structure of DNA, the molecule that carries the instructions for building every living thing on this planet, from bacteria to blue whales to your weird neighbour who refuses to mow his lawn. And the shape of this molecule turned out to be a double helix, which is a fancy term for 2 strands twisting around each other like the world's most elegant spiral staircase. Except this staircase contains every blueprint for every organism that has ever existed. Now here is where things get suspicious in the most beautiful way possible. The genetic code that runs inside that double helix is not written in a long continuous stream of letters. It is broken up into discrete units called codons, and each codon is made of exactly 3 nucleotide bases. Read together, that code for a single amino acid. 3 letters per packet. Always 3. The basic unit of biological information on Earth is a triplet. The basic unit of biological information on planet Earth is a triplet. Every protein in your body, every enzyme, every cell, every thought you've ever had is being assembled right now by molecular machinery, reading the universe's instructions 3 letters at a time. If you've been following the pattern in this story, your eyebrow should be doing some serious cardio at this point, because the same number that built the pyramids, structured the gods, organised alchemy, and obsessed Isaac Newton also turns out to be the fundamental reading frame of the genetic code itself. Life, on the most basic chemical level, is written in triplets. Whatever programmed this code, whether you call it evolution, God, or something stranger, decided that 3 was the magic packet size. Which is exactly the kind of coincidence that stops feeling like a coincidence after about the 17th occurrence. Francis Crick, who you would expect to be the world's #1 cheerleader for the natural origin of life since he literally discovered the structure of its information system, did something completely unexpected later in his career. He started doubting it. Specifically, he started doubting that DNA could have arisen on Earth by chance. He looked at the molecule he'd helped describe, did the math on how unlikely it was for something this sophisticated to spontaneously assemble in some random puddle of primordial soup, and concluded the numbers just didn't add up. The improbability was, in his own words, astronomical. The universe simply wasn't old enough, in his calculation, for random chemistry to have stumbled into this kind of elegant solution. So Crick, this Nobel laureate, this pillar of modern molecular biology, this guy you would assume would die on the hill of natural earthbound origins, proposed an alternative. In 1973, together with another scientist named Leslie Orgel, he formally suggested the theory of directed panspermia. The idea is exactly as wild as it sounds. Crick argued that life on Earth might not have started here at all. It might have been deliberately seeded by an intelligent civilization elsewhere in the cosmos, sent across interstellar distances in some kind of biological payload, designed to take root on a planet with the right conditions and grow into whatever came next. Which would, naturally, be us. Let that sink in. The man who literally helped discover the structure of DNA went on the record saying he thought the most plausible explanation for how it got here was that someone shipped it. Not in a metaphor, not in a poem, in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. He even did the back-of-the-envelope calculations for what kind of spacecraft would be required, what size payload, what shielding. He treated it as a serious hypothesis, not a cocktail party joke, and mainstream biology in response mostly pretended he hadn't said it. Because if you're trying to run a respectable science department, having one of the founders of your entire field publicly suggest extraterrestrial origins is, professionally speaking, what we might call a downer. But once you start looking at DNA the way ancient astronaut researchers look at it, the directed panspermia idea stops sounding wild and starts sounding almost obvious. DNA has properties that, if you were designing a long-term information storage medium for use across cosmic timescales, you would basically write down as your wish list. It is incredibly stable. Under the right conditions, it can survive for millions of years, which is how scientists today can extract genetic material from preserved remains of long-extinct creatures and read it. It self-replicates with high fidelity, meaning copies of copies of copies still preserve the original information with very few errors. The error rate is so low it's almost suspicious. We're talking less than one mistake per billion base pairs in some cases, which is engineering tolerances that would make the entire semiconductor industry weep with envy. And it carries enormous amounts of information in microscopic space. A single gram of DNA can theoretically store more data than every hard drive currently in existence on Earth combined. It is, hands down, the most efficient information storage medium ever discovered, and it just happens to be the medium running every living thing on the planet. If you were an advanced civilization wanting to send a message that would survive for billions of years, that could carry massive amounts of data, that could propagate itself without infrastructure, and that could keep transmitting its payload to future generations on autopilot, you would invent something that looks almost exactly like DNA. Or, you would just use DNA, because somebody already invented it. Ancient astronaut theorists take the next logical step. They argue that DNA isn't just a chemical molecule, it's a message. Embedded in the so-called junk DNA that makes up roughly 98% of the human genome, the parts that don't appear to code for proteins, there might be hidden patterns, signatures, maybe even literal communications. Modern genetics is only just starting to figure out that junk DNA isn't actually junk. Large chunks of it regulate gene expression, control developmental timing, and do all kinds of things biologists are still untangling. Ancient astronaut researchers go further. They suspect there's something in there that's not just biological regulation, something more like a watermark, a signature, a note left by whoever wrote the original code, just waiting for the descendants smart enough to find it. Will we ever decode it? Maybe parts of it are being decoded right now in ways nobody recognizes yet. Or maybe the message was never meant to be read in language. Maybe the message is the form itself, triplet codons, 3 letters at a time, now copying itself trillions of times a day inside every single one of your cells, which brings us finally to one of the strangest places this whole investigation has any right to land. A temple on the west bank of the Nile, in a town called Edfu. The temple itself is impressively well preserved, mostly because the desert sands buried it for centuries and protected it from the usual fate of ancient monuments, which is being chiselled apart for someone's garden wall. When archaeologists cleared the sand away in the 1800s, they found a structure covered in inscriptions, and a substantial portion of those inscriptions describe something archaeologists call the Edfu texts. These texts are not your standard royal propaganda, they are a creation story. Specifically, they describe a creation that happened long before Egypt itself existed, in a primordial age when the gods walked the earth. The Edfu texts describe 3 distinct groups of primordial beings who lived during this earlier age. The first group are called the sages, ancient teachers said to possess vast knowledge. The second are called the builders, who constructed the first sacred sites. And the third group has a name so untranslatable that Egyptologists basically just transliterate it. They're called the Shebtiu, sometimes rendered as the Shiptiu, depending on whose translation you read. The Shebtiu are described as rising up out of the waters of a primordial ocean and constructing the first temple on an island. 3 groups, working together, founding civilization on a single landmass in the middle of an endless sea. The island itself has a name. The Egyptians called it the Island of the Egg, and they describe it in terms that read less like mythology and more like a memory. It was, according to the texts, a real place, a great landmass, the original home of the gods, where the very first temples were built, where the first sacred geometry was applied to stone, where the foundation of everything that came later was laid down. And then, according to the same texts, disaster struck. A serpent enemy, called in some translations the Great Leaping One, appeared. Darkness fell over the island. A massive flood overwhelmed it, and the Island of the Egg, along with most of its inhabitants, was destroyed and submerged. Now, if that story sounds suspiciously familiar, it's because it predates a much more famous version of the same legend. Plato's account of Atlantis, written somewhere around 360 BC, describes an advanced civilization on a massive island that sank beneath the waves after offending the gods. Plato claimed he got the story from Egyptian priests, who had records of it going back thousands of years before his own time. And here we are, looking at actual Egyptian temple inscriptions that describe exactly that kind of catastrophic island civilization. Plato wasn't making it up. He was relaying a story the Egyptians had been carving into their walls long before any Greek philosopher knew how to spell. The truly wild question, the one that turns this whole chapter into something more than mythology, is what the original island actually was. Where on a real map could you put an enormous landmass, sitting alone in the middle of a great ocean, large enough to host an entire founding civilization? Most of the candidates people propose, like sunken Mediterranean islands or undersea ridges in the Atlantic, are too small or too geologically unrealistic. The only landmass on Earth that fits the description in terms of sheer size, and that sits in geographical isolation surrounded by ocean, is Antarctica. Antarctica, the frozen continent, the one currently buried under miles of ice and assumed to have been uninhabited for the entirety of human history, except, awkwardly, there's a piece of evidence that suggests it might not have always been that way. In 1531, a French mathematician named Laurent Fine produced a world map, which is itself impressive because Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. Fine's map, drawn nearly 3 centuries before anyone in the official record laid eyes on the place, shows a continent in roughly the right location, with rivers and coastlines suggesting it was not always covered in ice. The position is off by about 7.5 degrees, which is suspicious enough on its own, but the existence of the map at all raises uncomfortable questions about what older source material Fine was working from. Researchers who've looked into this have proposed that Fine, and other Renaissance cartographers like Piri-Reis, had access to much older maps. Maps possibly going back to Phoenician, Egyptian, or even prehistoric sources, depicting Antarctica in a warmer, ice-free state. Mainstream geology says Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years, so any map showing it without ice would have to be either fictional or based on a memory older than humanity. Which is a problem, because the maps exist, the shapes match, and the legend, written on the walls of Edfu, describes a great island civilization that was destroyed in a cataclysm thousands of years before any official history began. Ancient astronaut theorists have a tidy hypothesis here. Antarctica, before the ice came down, was home to an advanced civilization, possibly the one the Egyptians remembered as the island of the egg, possibly the source of the sacred geometry, the divine triads, the alchemical codes, the hermetic wisdom, the triplet structure that keeps echoing through everything. The same builders who knew how to align stones to constellations, who taught Pythagoras' teachers, who gave us the gods and the formulas and the foundational number 3, might be sitting under 2 miles of ice right now waiting to be rediscovered. Their cities frozen, their libraries preserved, their message still encoded in our genes, in our myths, in our buildings, patiently waiting for the species they helped seed to finally grow up and come knocking. And the signature they left, the one they apparently stamped on every layer of reality we've inherited, is the same simple, stubborn, ridiculous little number that has followed us through every chapter of this investigation. 3 sides of a triangle, 3 pyramids in the desert, 3 stars on the belt of Orion, 3 principles of alchemy, 3 laws of motion, 3 molecules per codon. 3 is not a coincidence. 3, if you take the trail seriously, is a calling card. And we, at long last, with our gene sequencers and our satellite imagery and our radar maps of Antarctic ice, are just barely starting to read it.